Using the Zimbabwe example again, so like, I just don't think that if you ask a tyrannical government, if you like kick them out, and we're like, oh, you know, you need to become respectable, like, they don't really have any incentive to do that aside from, you know, these privileges, but
Well,
I don't think there's a real incentive. And so what I'm saying is that, like, if you want to take the German example of, like, the end of World War I, they had that war guild, and we're like, you need to pay all this money, and they couldn't do it. And they're sort of like kicking them when they're down, and that
Well,
happens with Hitler. So it's like,
I think we should have kicked the Germans a bit harder at the end of World War I, not rather easier. It would have been much simpler if we made it clear to Germany that they had lost the war. The big delusion that Germany has at the end of World War I was that they didn't lose. And after World War II, we left them in no doubt whatsoever that they had lost the war. And that was actually a very good thing, because it meant they had no excuses. Hitler and the far right in Germany thrive above all on this stab in the back myth. The idea that we weren't beaten in the field, we were betrayed by a democratic government and the Jews at home. That's A, that's wrong, Germany did lose in the field, and B, it's politically the most destructive myth they could possibly have entertained, because it gave a lot of otherwise very respectable people a really good reason, so they thought, to oppose democracy and basic standards of human behavior. So I think we should have made it very clear to Germany at the end of World War I that they had lost. Now, we could talk about how sort of historically viable that is, and I accept there's some difficulties there. Nonetheless, the standard that we used in World War II, unconditional surrender. Churchill puts it very well. When he's asked in the House of Commons what unconditional surrender means, he says, it means that we have no obligations whatsoever except the obligations of common humanity. No deals. That's a bit. That was the correct policy to follow. Now, the question of Zimbabwe. I take it as a given that nations value the privileges they get as a result of sovereignty, because they demand them very insistently and they take advantage of them all the time. The only other avenue for putting pressure on a state like this is generally what I would call sanctions. And you know, there's a zillion and one form of sanctions. And you sanction trade, you sanction finance, etc., all sorts of things. Sanctions generally end up hurting regular people. And the reason they do that should be fairly obvious. I'm a dictator, and you are my population. And I have just been sanctioned, and I shall have, in theory, no more international trade except what everyone smuggles to me. But I shall, in theory, have no more international trade. I have a certain amount of food to distribute. Who here is in favor of me? Hands up, who wants food? Come on! Yeah, okay, all of those who don't put your hands up, you all get to serve. That'll be fun. That tends to be the dynamic that you get with externally imposed sanctions that target whole countries. The effect tends to filter down to utterly innocent people who oppose the regime, or at least are not vocal enough about supporting it for one reason or another. Generally, they're an ethnic or religious population. So therefore, if I'm not really very wild about those sorts of broad sanctions, the only other tool you've got is taking away the privileges of sovereignty that belong preeminently to the elite. Now, you may say that won't work. Well, why don't we try an experiment and give it a shot? Because we've tried the other policy of letting them in and giving them a ton of privileges, and it hasn't caused them to reform. So why don't we try the other approach, just for a while, and see if it produces some results. I have the feeling that a lot of these places value these privileges quite a lot, because that's the way they act, and that they would be encouraged to amend their behavior if they saw that other people took these standards seriously. We could at least try. Yes, sir.
You mentioned sort of creating, I guess, competing international organizations that have these standards as sort of entrants. What would your view of the role and shape of these kind of organizations be?
I want to start somewhere in particular. As with picking on a nation, I want to start with the Zimbabwe case. For international organizations, I want to start with human rights. There are a lot. I mean, there are economic international organizations. There are collective security international organizations. There are some very technical bodies, most of which actually work pretty well. And there are human rights organizations. Those are the worst. because they are so, first of all, they are so corrupted by membership of so many places that have no respect for human rights. The UN Human Rights Council now is the worst it has ever been, in spite of the fact that the U.S. has rejoined. There are now more dictatorships and more autocracies on it than there have ever been before. Start a new human rights organization. And the principle of your human rights organization is, and I hope this isn't too shocking, you have to respect basic human rights in order to be in it. Okay, and that's the standard. Now, what should it do? What it should not do is spend a lot of time investigating its members, because there are conditions for membership, right? So what it should do instead is it should investigate countries that are actually culpable of gross human rights violations. It should provide, when it has the chance to do so in a genuinely fair way, election monitoring services. It should be a mechanism for coordinating assistance to countries that genuinely do want to improve their judicial, their electoral, their police performance. And it should be a way to call to account countries that are outside the system that are seen to be backsliding. In other words, it should combine something of a censoring role, something of an approval role, and something of a helping role, but on the basis that once you're in, unless you go through the Weimar Republic to Hitler transformation, you're in, and therefore you're judged to be basically okay. So focus on the other guys, because right now, I don't know how many people follow the UN Human Rights Council. The UN Human Rights Council was considering Libya's report, the country report on Libya's human rights, this spring. Yes, this spring. And Libya received superb reviews from many members of the Council. The Council made a total of 69 recommendations for Libya to improve its performance in the context of Libya's generally extraordinarily commendable effort on human rights. The U.S. received over 250 recommendations. I would submit to you that that is not a serious organization. And therefore, we should probably try to find another one. Okay, I want to toss it back over to Heather, who's going to say a few words about Young Leaders Program. I'd be happy to chat afterwards if anyone wants to stick around.
Great. Thanks very much, Ken. Well, I'll be happy to stick around. I know as well as the Dartmouth Review and Polytalk, so make sure to seek us all out. But as we close, I wanted to talk a little bit about our Young Leaders Program, which I direct at Heritage. I have the great privilege of overseeing all of our outreach to the next generation, which is you. I think whether we're talking about foreign policy issues or the economy or healthcare, the decisions that we make today are going to impact us much more than our parents and grandparents. So I really just thank you guys coming out and engaging, and it's great to see you really thinking about these issues, because there's not one answer, but it's really great to see you all engaging. I passed along a sheet if any of you are interested in signing up for our Young Leaders Program email. Once a week we send out an email to keep you all posted on the kind of policy that Ted and our team at Heritage is working on. So we filter through all those different issues to make sure you know what's up to date on Capitol Hill and that in-depth research we're working on. So sign up and start getting those alerts. If you guys are Facebookers or Twitterers, we're of course on there. So pull out your phones, like us on there, and we do updates all throughout the day to make sure that you know what policy papers are coming out, reading our commentary on all of the different issues. And then finally, for those of you who are really leaders and want to really get involved in the policy process, we do offer the best internship program in DC. Sterling mentioned up at the front that he was a part of it. We had the privilege of having him with us this past summer. And we just run the best internship program. We have two main tracks. One is the policy side, where you're partnered up with someone like Ted, and you really focus in on the writing and the researching. So you get to come, focus in on whatever your passion issue is. If you're like me and a little bit more business oriented, you can focus in on one of our communications departments, our youth outreach, our government relations. So whatever your major might be, you can come work for an organization that you support, but get really practical work experience.